Some transitions do not announce themselves as turning points. They begin quietly, often after something familiar stops working the way it once did. For Philip, that moment arrived after leaving a startup role that had defined much of his professional identity. What followed was not a clear next step, but a period of questioning about work, about purpose, and about what midlife really asks of people who have spent decades building careers, responsibilities, and expectations. This conversation explores that space many people reach but rarely talk about openly. The moment when success on paper does not necessarily translate into fulfillment, and when burnout forces a deeper look at what matters next. Philip shares how that reflection eventually led him to start the Midlife Men podcast, a platform designed to give men a place to talk honestly about identity, mental health, career shifts, and the quiet struggles that often go unspoken. Along the way, we talk about vulnerability, why many men find it difficult to ask for help, and how humor can make conversations about heavy topics more accessible. This is not a conversation about midlife crisis. It is a conversation about midlife awareness, about recognizing when something needs to change, and having the courage to begin exploring what that change might look like. Welcome to No One is Normal, the podcast where real stories remind us that none of us are alone. You can also visit the website www.bradhhill.com or www.nooneisnormal.co for resources, updates, and future podcast episodes. I am Brad H. Hill, and each week we talk about the messy, the complicated, and the deeply human moments that shape us and remain in our memories. I am not here to tell anyone how to live. I am here to offer the stories, the insights that made me realize that no one is normal, including me, because healing starts when self-honesty begins. Hey Phil, thank you for coming on the show today.
Hi, Brad. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's dig in, right?
Sure, sure.
You host a podcast called Midlife Men. What led you to wanting to start a podcast based on that topic?
Now, that is a very good question, Brad. So, I am a midlife man, so that qualifies me, I think. So, I guess going back 3 years now, podcast's been going 3 years. So, I was in my early 50s, and I had just finished working for a kind of startup where I've been for 10 years, and I'd really given it everything. Missed the sort of thing where you miss birthdays and funerals. I really gave it all. And then towards the very end, I was just treated, like crap, basically. I was they brought in someone who did some kind of transformation, and all my hard effort, I felt like it was for nothing. Which hit me really hard actually. And maybe I should have been less naive and thought, well, this might come at some point. So I decided to leave and do something else. But I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had no idea. I've worked in tech for 30 years. Um, and in this startup, I did every role, from chief operating officer to chief marketing officer. And I just wanted to do something completely different. But I didn't know what. And as I started to think about what it is I could do, I realized that my identity, who I am, who I relate to being, is really tied up in the job I do. And so without really having a job, then I kind of felt a bit lost. So I started to look around and see are there other guys who feel like this? Is anyone talking about this? Are there any resources? And I couldn't really find anything at all. Um, and I thought, because I think I'm a bit of a repressed journalist, maybe a repressed broadcaster. When I was 18, I applied to go to journalism school, but I was too much of a hedonist and I failed the entrance exam. I wasn't really interested, but I should have listened to my inner voice then. So I thought, hey, why don't I start a podcast? Didn't know anything about it, but I thought if I feel like this, I'm sure there are lots of other men who feel like this. And so the first episode I actually spoke to a guy. There's a show called Master Chef. I don't know if you have that in the US as well.
Yeah, we
So
have that in the US, yep.
you get kind of amateur chefs, and they all compete to be the master chef. And this guy I spoke to, he was a finalist in one of the first master chefs, and he gone from, I think he worked in finance, to being a really successful chef, having his own restaurant, etc. So I spoke to him, and that was great. That was kind of an example of somebody who talked through a kind of change in life and change in career and everything. But then the next one I did, to cut a long story short, it very soon turned into a kind of show about more midlife challenges and more about, mental health challenges that men can face, especially in their middle years. So that's really how the podcast came into being, which is a very long answer to your original question.
Yeah, and no, it makes perfect sense because I'm not too far behind you. So I think in the midlife we kind of spend a little bit more time reflecting, right? You're so taught through the young part of your life just to put your head down and work, and then you get to the point where like, well, wait a second, am I actually happy doing what I'm doing, or am I just collecting a paycheck and just fulfilling somebody else's dream, you know?
I think that's so right, and I do believe you have phases in life, and I think there's a phase, when you go out to work, and then you have this kind of career phase. Not everybody, but some people, and you just think, right, as you said, I get my head down, I'll work as hard as I can. I want to get career progression. I want to earn more money. I'm going to value my success by my salary and by my position, my title. And along the way, maybe you have a family or maybe you don't. But I think that's a phase. And then when you get into your, late middle age, whenever that kicks in, late 40s, 50s, or whatever, I think you start to value things that are important differently. Um, and I think there is ageism in the workplace, whatever anybody says, there is. And I think you start to think, well, hey, there are other people coming up behind me. I've put all this effort in, and I don't necessarily feel it was worth it. There are other things that are more important. So yeah, and that's difficult to grapple with, especially when you've put so much into your career, and then you feel unfulfilled, and that's a bit disappointing, and it doesn't leave you in a great place. Not just from a happiness perspective, but in terms of how do you spend then the next, you're only kind of, say you're 50, you've got quite a long way to go and quite a long way in the workplace. So what do you do? And it's all very confusing, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you spend so much time working a job, you spend more time with your people you work with than you do with your own family, but you get sleep for 8 hours if you're lucky, you get getting ready for work, getting home from work, and then the drive and commute, and you have dinner, a couple of home chores, and then kiss your wife goodnight, and you go back and spend another 8 hours just grinding all day, 8 to 10 hours, whatever you do, or sometimes 12. It was my case where I was getting so burnt out, I just got to the point I'm like, I need to change because this is driving me into the ground. I don't know if you've ever had that where you just all of a sudden you're like, I am burnt out, I can't do anymore.
Yeah, totally. And it can, when you're younger and your body's younger, uh, and perhaps you've got a different outlook on life, I think you can kind of absorb that sort of lifestyle. But certainly, maybe 5 years ago, I um I went to the doctors, and it was something completely different. And I had a medical check, and basically the doctor said to me, "You've got you're obese," which I had put on a lot of weight, but hearing someone saying that to you, you're obese, you've got very high blood pressure, you've developed type 2 diabetes, and you've got fatty liver, quite a bad fatty liver. And I guess I've been living a completely naive life, and just couldn't get my head around it, and I was really shocked. And I do think a lot of that was attributed to the fact that I just put myself last and work first, and I was probably drinking too much, using it as an emotional, well, not an emotional, but just a crutch, to relax. I'll relax and have an alcoholic drink, and of course, actually, it doesn't help you relax. It's a temporary solution, but actually it makes things worse. But difficult especially when that's a routine, Friday nights, I'm gonna, open a bottle of wine or crack open some beer, whatever it is you do. And not eating well because you're working late, you grab what you can, or you're just eating, like in the UK, everyone kind of has sandwiches at lunchtime, but they're not very healthy, it's kind of bread with some filling and mayo, and so when you've done that for 25 years, it starts to take its toll. So yeah, and I think burnout. can be attributed to a lot of factors, physical and mental. And I think often one almost causes the other. You know, if you're really low, if you're really kind of unhealthy, and then on top of that, you are not in a good place in terms of your mental health, and that's not a good place to be in, and it can hit you really hard. It hit me.
Yeah, it did the same for me. It really, I was working 12s, 7 days a week, and I got to the point where, like you, I was working my butt off for a company. I was not getting any resources to help, and my health was starting to really decline. I was getting kind of into a rut, and I could not get out of it, and it just felt like there was no help along the way. And I think one of the best things I did, and it was probably the scariest things I've ever done, is I left the company without anything for backup. Right? I don't recommend that to anybody, but doing so like gave me a little bit of time to reflect and to actually really find what I wanted to do, and it gave me the opportunity to, you're not trying to fill out applications, do a resume, cover letter while you're working so many hours because you really don't have time to devote to it. And I spent that time to really one work on my physical health, my mental health, and make sure that I'm looking for that next opportunity that is the correct one. Now, fast forward from April till November of this last year, complete life changing, uh, momentum shifting, job changing, career change for me that made sense. I wrote a book in that time, started the podcast, and now I've got a great restart on a career, midlife, right? And then starting a podcast because I want to reach out and help as many people as I can because, like people are struggling and it's important to get your word across.
Yeah, definitely. And I did similar to you actually, Brad. You know, I left this job, this company, and I didn't have anything to go to. I just knew I didn't want to do, knew what I didn't want to do. And I guess, you know, you do have to have a little bit of luxury of a bit of money behind you, you know, because I think a lot of people I speak to are kind of trapped, and they're only a couple of paychecks away from not being able to pay the mortgage or whatever. And I didn't have that much, but I had a bit of room. And I thought, do you know what? I've worked for 25, 30 years. If I can't live off my wits, if I can't do something off my own back. So I started a kind of small consultancy company, and I've been doing that 3 years. And that's really fulfilling for me on a work front because I choose who I want to work with. I work with really great people doing really interesting work. But similar to you, I found the podcast. Now the podcast is free for anyone to access it. That was the whole point. You know, it's to help people. And I read a book as well, which I've always wanted to do, and I write fiction as well. I'm writing a novel at the moment, all around kind of mental health and men's kind of mental health, and that's been far more fulfilling than when I was working. And I achieved a lot in my earlier career, uh, but it's a lot of it's about fulfillment. And you know, you can't spend your life waiting for the weekend or your holiday, you know, your or Christmas or retirement. You can't spend your life doing that. And I think a lot of people resign themselves to that, or they think, you know, hey, I'm 58, I'm going to retire in, you know, 7 years, whatever it is. You know, that's not a way to live. Because and so and I know it's not easy, and there's no magic wands, and there's no magic advice other than, you know, it's not an overnight thing. You do need to plan for it. You do need to plan and see what's happening. Um, and then you've just got to get on with it, really.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than just peeling off calendar months and you're not doing anything to make yourself better or improve anything, right? You're just going through the motions and you're just, okay, this is my settle, this is what I'm doing, and then I'm going to go till retirement. Well, then retirement happens, and then you look back and say, well, I could have done something better or different and made a little bit more uh, influential change for myself and done something that I wanted to do versus doing something that I had to do for a paycheck.
And a lot of people, as I said, a lot of people feel backed into that corner. You know, it's especially when you're feeling, you know, depressed or you are struggling, maybe you're addicted to something, or you just don't feel, it's difficult enough getting out of bed and going to work, let alone then thinking, well, how do I get out of this situation? And I need the money, I've got a family to support, or whatever it might be, I've got debts. It's really tough, you do feel backed into a corner, and it's difficult. I mean, one thing I've learned talking to all the men I've spoken to for the podcast, which is nearly 100 now, it's very difficult to do this by yourself. It's very difficult to do if you don't tell anyone, if you keep it to yourself. And the likelihood is you're not the only person that feels the way you do. As title of your show is "No One Is Normal," and you know, we're all of us are suffering in some way or another. And even if people think they're not, there's something. But if you don't tell anyone, and you just assume that everyone else is leading their best life and their Instagram life, whatever it might be, you're not going to start to help yourself. And of course, it's about the book I wrote is called Men Speak Up, um, and it's not just about speaking up, because you have to do it in the right environment to the right person. I think a lot of guys, perhaps see their buddies that they've known from college days or whatever, and go out and meet up. Um, and there's a kind of there's the conversation never gets beyond quite shallow, and it's good for the soul and it's banter, but actually it doesn't really. There's never really a proper conversation going on there about how you're actually feeling, and it's just the environment you're in, and so maybe sometimes it's great to talk to someone you don't know. Maybe that's easier to talk to, or there are a lot of men's groups around. There are a lot of associations that you can speak to, join, call up. It is out there and it's easy to find, actually, and increasingly so. But it's very difficult to do by yourself.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the big thing that you really spoke to was talking about it. And that's almost universal, almost everywhere when you talk to different people from different countries, is you're taught not to say something because it's shown as weakness, to kind of hold it in. And then when you do let it out, sometimes people say, well, you're just complaining. Well, if I'm complaining and I continue to say the same thing over and over, maybe I need to change how I'm saying it, but my audience isn't paying attention to how I'm saying it and they're just saying, well, you're just complaining, whatever, you know?
So you're talking to the wrong person. It's the wrong audience. And it doesn't mean they don't love you, or, they're not supportive in other ways, but they're probably the wrong person. And sometimes, often, I think it's not necessarily your partner, um, because, they're not trained. Perhaps they don't really want to hear it. I don't know. I mean, I think, unfortunately, in some situations, and I'm talking about, more traditional marriages here, where you've got the guy who's, the kind of strong alpha male, and then and that's the role they're expected to play. So, and a lot of men, I think, are putting on a mask, and I think that can be very difficult because they can't. That's what they're expected to do in that role in their relationship or in the family. So it's very difficult to ever speak to somebody who's very close to you. So often it's and I think if you go along to one of the many men's groups, the room's probably full of people who feel similar. They're having to play a role, and as you said, environmental, societal, however, especially men, who are older, grew up, in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, maybe before, um, and it wasn't, you didn't show vulnerability, in the schoolyard, you didn't show it in the workplace. It just wasn't done. So all that stuff gets buried quite deep, and it's quite difficult to come out or find the opportunity to talk to somebody. And that's when the trajectory of how you're feeling can get really dangerous, actually, because if you're just going down a rabbit hole where you're feeling worse and worse and worse, and you're more depressed and you're drinking more, and I'm just using these as examples, ultimately, what's at the end of that? Well, unfortunately, it's suicidal tendencies. It's thinking, actually, I don't want to be around anymore because I've just, that's my only option. And I think, we have to, all of us, society, and for the men in our lives, we've got to try and address that earlier, because once we need to get to people before they're reaching the end of that trajectory, because unfortunately, those statistics are only getting worse. They're not getting better. So something's not working. And it's happening all the time. And that's the worst case scenario of bottling this all up, not talking to anyone.
Yeah, I agree. I've lost a few friends to, you know, taking their own life, and it was their moment was the darkest moment they had, and it was something that was mostly probably fixable through communication and talking about it and talking with somebody and trying to understand the feeling, but it just seemed like they didn't have uh, the ability to talk with somebody, and that's always tough, and you really need to have that, like you said, a good audience and a good uh, kind of group of people that you can talk to when you need to, and be able to sometimes bounce ideas off of, and kind of tell them how you're feeling without judgment, without being berated, right? You need to be able to feel comfortable in stating what you're stating. I think that's important.
Yeah, and I think we have responsibilities as well. I mean, we need to be better at keeping an eye out for these sorts of things, because a lot of men will mask how they're really feeling. Um, and unless you ask someone directly, and I'm talking about, when things are really serious here, where people are thinking about taking their own life, you've got to be brave yourself, and you do have to say, look, are you thinking of taking your own life? And it's blunt, and it's a very difficult question to ask. But if you don't ask it directly, then if you say something like, you're not thinking of doing something silly, are you? Uh, a lot of men in that situation will go, well, I don't think it's silly. What I'm doing isn't silly. And we'll say, no, I'm not thinking of doing anything silly, or will mask. And, and I think it's really difficult. And I don't think we have that embedded in our psyche, in our conversations that we have in society. And we need to get better at that, I think, and better at looking out for each other. Um, it doesn't take anything really just to ask your buddies how they are on a regular basis, and especially ones. I mean, I guess sometimes you might suspect that someone is struggling. I guess the difficulty is when you don't suspect anything, and there are no signs and there are no symptoms.
Yeah, you see that quite often, where people, they have this nice polished look to them, they seem confident, and then all of a sudden you hear something happened. Like, wow, I didn't expect that at all. There was no telltale signs. There was nothing that they put out forward that really showed it. And then next thing you know, you're like, could I have done something to change that? And you kind of start questioning yourself. Did I miss some signs? And that's very hard to kind of look back and say, did I miss something? Have you had that happen to you?
I haven't actually, not directly. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of men who have had their own thoughts of taking their own lives, and they haven't because I've interviewed them. Um, but I think again, it's one of these things where a lot more men have those occasional thoughts than other people think, and it doesn't necessarily mean. And I should just say, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a practitioner. I allow people to tell their stories. That's really what I do. But I think you know a lot of men, I think it's just I don't. It's not that I don't want to be here. I just don't want to live with the life I'm living, but I don't know how to fix it. Um, and if you're trying to do that yourself, it's very difficult. So if we've got more, and this is why I do the podcast, and probably why you do as well. The more people that can share their story, and I call them recovery narratives. The more men that talk about the first-hand experience they've had, and they're very happy to share what they've been through, really on a raw and honest basis, because I think that's the only way that it connects with anyone. And then talk about the way forward. That's really important. What they did, and it doesn't mean it's going to work for anybody else, but it just allows people listening to the men I interviewed, to sharing their stories, to take something from it. And maybe it's just the realization or the recognition that actually they're not the only person that's ever felt like this. And where possible, signposting to help. But increasingly, what is getting better, I think, is there is more noise around mental health. There are high profile celebrities who talk about their mental health. Now, that obviously really helps, because they're going to get they're going to get the attention, in the media. So, that I think there's a lot of good stuff happening, but it's still, we're still missing something, um, as is evidenced by, the fact that we've still got a lot of people who end up, taking their own lives. But I think it's about, certainly from my perspective, it's about, that's right at the end of the trajectory. I'm just trying to get people early on by allowing men to share their stories. Hey, that connects a bit, that relates a bit. Yes, I can. I that is familiar. Hey, I'll listen to this then, and I'll hear what this guy's done, how he's found a way forward, and hopefully that is one thing amongst many, many others of podcasts and men's groups and all sorts of, people, influencers, people talking about this, that just starts to shift the generally, the understanding and perception in society of mental health.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that it is getting better, but you still kind of see it where it's not as much front and center. You'll see mentionings of something like that, but then it kind of goes into the more um, sensationalism shows everywhere, and it's like you people are kind of struggling, and not only emotionally, but now with kind of with social media, and you look at how much is just getting thrown at everybody, and you're just, you can make a statement, somebody just berates you or misunderstands it, and there's so many people that can say something negative to you, and it just festers. And to me, I think social media is great. You get such a connection, but it's also so bad that it creates this kind of vacuum where you expect to have this positive experience, but yet when you sometimes make statements, it comes back in such a negative way, and you're like, well, Christ, well, this sucks. What do I do now? I got like 8 people jumping on me because I made a statement, and it just creates this extra pressure almost.
Yeah, I mean, that is the problem, because once you put yourself out there, I mean, not everybody, it's very easy to hide behind social media platform and almost take on a different persona. I mean, there's a lot of negativity out there. I mean, my own opinion is, I think just shut yourself off from most of it. I think on balance, a lot of it's quite negative. All the kind of platforms that showcase everyone having a great life and a great time. Well, they're probably not, and it doesn't help when you're not having a great time, because it just makes you feel more inferior and paranoid. The comms tools are great to keep up with people, but even LinkedIn, which is supposedly a business channel, I think that's also started to go that way as well, where hey, I've just raised another $4 billion on my, I'm about to have my second exit, and all this stuff just makes people feel like they're a bit of a failure, I think, and that's not positive. And great if you have, but also on Facebook, I use Facebook, and maybe I'm just getting targeted with these ads because I keep looking at them. But there's every other kind of instances. Hey, you can make all this money really quickly online, and use AI to create a tool and sell it 50 times, and all this kind of false promises. And so for people who are a bit desperate and wanting to get out of a situation or find an easy win, it's so easy to get caught up in that. And and you and I know you can't make money easily. You can't. It's hard graft. If you want to make money, you have to work hard at it. Maybe there's a very few exceptions, but I do think it's not used for the general good. And you know what? I mean, when we were growing up, there wasn't social media. There weren't even mobile phones. Uh, and we kind of managed okay, actually. And I'm not saying it's not progress and it's not great. Of course, it is. Technology is amazing, but I think sometimes it's unnecessary influence and noise, especially when you need some direction and some peace. But it's with us, isn't it, to not engage. I know that's quite difficult in our kind of dopamine fueled world where we're just looking for the next kind of hit. Um, but just don't use it. Don't use it.
Taking a quick pause here. If this episode is resonating, I would love for you to follow the No One is Normal podcast on whatever platform you listen on. Every follow helps this show reach people who might need these stories. Now let's jump back in. You kind of made some really good points there, right? And the other thing I've found that's really kind of disheartening for me is you have to pay the algorithm, right? You have to pay to get your stuff seen. So it's no longer I put my stuff out there and it grows kind of naturally. It's I have to pay, whether like even for companies to put a job posting out there now. In order for your ad to stay up there, you got to pay money just to keep it there. Well, that's great. LinkedIn, you got to sometimes pay money, whether it's pro or for ads. Same thing with Facebook. If you have something that you're selling, you got to advertise it. So everything is, it's a great tool, but it's also gotten to the point where now it's just you throwing money at something. If you don't have a good directive of here's my lane, you just throwing money away, and it just seems there's so much now where it's easy to just get lost in the amount of money that you throw and not see a return. It's easy just to kind of give up. And I don't know if you've seen that, especially you being in the tech sector. Has that kind of shown the same for you?
Well, it's kind of out of your control, and the tech giants make the rules, so you don't know. You're paying the money, but you have no control over how effective that dollar's going to be, that ad spend or whatever. Certainly for the podcast, I don't spend any money on advertising. I From the beginning, I wanted it to survive on word of mouth and validate itself through its quality. And luckily, it has. It's listened to in something like 60 countries around the world, and there's tens of thousands of people listening to it, which is brilliant. But yeah, I refuse to pay to make that happen because I have no control. And I think it's a bit like you could quite easily go and buy a load of followers, uh, or people, supposed listeners for your podcast and increase the downloads. But it's fake. What's the point of doing that? What's the point of artificially increasing the amount of followers you've got when it's all either completely made up or it's just people that aren't interested? I mean, it's about having a real audience and a real fit for your voice and for what you're trying to tell people. And that's just my opinion, but no, I don't go in for spending huge amounts of ad dollar trying to promote things.
Yeah, no, I'm a simple guy. I don't want to throw money away at something that hopefully can grow organically. And you got to be pretty impressed that you got over 60 countries, over 10,000 people that view your podcast. That's got to be a good feeling doing it naturally and organically versus just throwing money at it and saying, "Hey, look at this," and that way it feels more like you, right?
Well, I did it. I kind of started it as an experiment, really, just to see how it would work out. And because I didn't really have any expectations, I just kept at it, and I guess the more people you have listening to it, the more they tell people, and the more so exponentially the amount of downloads, increases over time. And I interview guys from all over the world. I mean, largely English speaking, but so I guess that helps in terms of the number of countries that people are listening in. But I think it just goes to show that there is a real requirement for this sort of conversation uh, for men and for older men, because I think we are a generation where, as we were saying earlier, we were brought up in an environment where you didn't talk about your feelings. You could have maybe anger and happiness. I don't know. You your feelings were quite limited. You certainly weren't going to show any vulnerability. It's kind of the word, this kind of macho guy, that especially growing up in the 70s and 80s and 90s or whatever. I mean, that it just didn't really exist. Men's mental health was not a topic that was discussed generally. Um, so I think it's partly because people are starting to realize that they can feel a bit more vulnerable, even if they don't admit it. And I think listening to podcasts is a really easy, unthreatening way in, because no one knows you. You can listen to it you know, when you're lying in bed or going for a run or in your car or just sat watching, whatever you want to do. No one needs to know. You can dip in and out of it. It doesn't cost anything. Um, and, so you can do it without anybody knowing. Um, and I think that's a really easy way for people to kind of start to understand a bit more, perhaps about how they're feeling, how other people are feeling. But I think increasingly as well, when I started the podcast, I thought it was for primarily aimed at guys who were feeling the same as my guests or me, but actually, I think increasingly, because some of those guys you just won't reach because they're so down in the weeds of this that they're never going to even admit and listen to a podcast called Midlife Men or No One Is Normal. I mean, they're just not going to go there. A lot of men will, but I think increasingly it's kind of people around them, their partners and brothers and sisters and parents or friends, colleagues, whatever, who notice that there's something going on and they don't know what to do. It's very difficult to approach someone, isn't it, who's obviously suffering, but perhaps is in complete denial, or perhaps they are interpreting, and there's a difference between mental illness and mental health in terms of just struggling and feeling depressed and drinking too much, etc. But I think a lot of men, might be addicted to something or are very angry all the time, or whatever it might be. There's behaviour and symptoms which they wouldn't necessarily associate with poor mental health, but actually the two things are very related. So I think a lot of men are not thinking, well, why would I listen to any sort of mental health podcast? I'm just probably drinking too much and getting, really angry at my family or whatever it might be. So I think there's often you're not going to reach those people, but you are going to reach people who are witnessing that and don't know what to do about it. They don't know how to approach somebody. I mean, how do you say to somebody you're very close to, listen, I think you're drinking too much, if they're just going to get really enraged by that. And, so I think increasingly it's helping other people who are trying to deal with men in their lives who are obviously suffering somehow. I don't know. Are you seeing the same thing?
Yeah, and I think it kind of boils down to ego, right? People think I am indestructible until they hit that point where they're like, okay, I need some help. I need something to happen. But people's egos really get in the way of actual change. And it's amazing how many people you talk to and you think like, hey, let's have a real serious conversation and not just brush it off because your ego is telling you, don't worry about it, I'm fine. And that is further from the truth.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. And I think another element is kind of trauma, and I use that word to mean really just things that perhaps happened to you when you were a lot younger. Maybe you grew up in a unhappy home. Maybe you were a victim of you know violence or even sexual abuse. There are a lot of things that men I think just push down, never try and deal with. hoping they'll just go away. And of course, they're not going to. They're just bubbling there. And on the whole, and again, I'm just saying this through my experience talking to other men about their experiences. I'm not a medical practitioner, but I think unless you confront that at some point, it's either going to blow up at some point, or it's just not going to. It's not going to allow you to really, sometimes even like yourself. If you don't like yourself, then it's very difficult to like other people, and for other people to like you. So I think often we're kind of conditioned to carry around any sort of baggage, never deal with it, push it right down. But it's not going to go away. It's going to come up and bite you on the ass at some point. So, I think, I had I had a growing up, my father was very, violent, aggressive, and of course, as a kid, you don't really know any different. And so you just bury that and you grow up and you hope that, you know, think, well, I'm never going to do this to my kids. And, I don't. I mean, of polar opposite. But, if you don't deal with it, and I have done now, but if you don't deal with it, it's there the whole time. And it's just one of those many things which is, um, you know, can cause deep depression or anxiety or other sorts of mental health conditions. So I think that's something else as well as ego. It's repressing any sort of traumatic events that have happened and just push it to one side and hope it'll go away.
Yeah, one thing that I kind of really put into my toolbox is one, forgiveness, and then two, even though they don't deserve it, forgiving others for what was done to me, right? That I do care, but I don't when I forgive others, if they forgive me or not, or if something changes. And but for me, it's just releasing that kind of tie where I'm holding that in my the back of my head the rest of my life. I'd rather just say, hey, you know what? I forgive you. I'm moving on. You know, and that probably doesn't work for everybody, but for me, it actually kind of helped me from keeping those things in my head rent free. You know, I don't know if that's been kind of something you've seen or done.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think going back to what we were saying, if you keep this to yourself, if you don't try and get any help, we haven't really talked about professional help. I mean, I went to see a psychotherapist. I decided that I'd had enough, because I could never get over it, and especially for example, if I had a few drinks, it would kind of come back to the surface, and then occasionally I might tell someone, and then I felt guilty because I told them, the next morning, and it just was really unhealthy. And I think my wife said to me at one point, she said, "Look, why don't you just go and see someone and talk about it?" So I did eventually go and see a psychotherapist, just to help me understand a bit more. And what was really interesting is it just explained a lot of my behaviors and a lot of the way I was thinking. And whilst none of it was that surprising because I could kind of join the dots, but it just really helped to talk to somebody else. And I always say that you can have it in your head and go round and round and round, and it's actually verbally articulating what's going on in your head to somebody to help them understand it, and say it in a way that they can understand really helps, because it really helps kind of put it into plain language. It helps you make sense of your own thoughts, explaining it to somebody else. And certainly the psychotherapist went to see, he didn't necessarily have any answers at all. And, he was clear from the beginning, didn't have any answers. But what he did do was just help me understand a few things. And I think that was a really good experience. And, I would recommend other people to do that. And, it might work, it might not. And I think it's really important that you get the right therapist as well. And there are lots out there. And a lot of the men I've spoken to have experienced therapy say sometimes you need one, two, three, four attempts before you find the right person. And again, it comes back to talking to the right person. You need to share things with the right person. So I would certainly advocate doing that, because as I say, it wasn't a magic wand. but it did help me make a little bit more sense about the effect it had had on me. And it did help. I think those things still happened. Nothing's going to change that. Um, but it helps you put them in perspective, and it also makes you realize that it wasn't your fault. I think a lot of people kind of blame themselves, um, and that just helps get your head in a better place, especially when you know that there's something wrong, and you should have really put it to bed years ago. Well, you can't unless you address it. And I think that's what my advice would be: try it. Try it when it worked for you.
Yeah, one thing that's good about in the US for us particularly, we have an EAP program. Most companies, if you work for them, they have an opportunity to call and talk with somebody to have that initial conversation. You know, I've utilized that. I've talked with people close to me. I've talked with therapists, um, and I think the big thing uh, between those, and sometimes people don't want to talk outwardly, is I've also journaled, right? I write a lot, and I sometimes will take journaling, write down what I'm feeling, and then I'll look back at it and kind of say, okay, what can I take away from this? And kind of, you do some kind of self-eval, and it doesn't work for a lot of people, right? But I think journaling and writing down your feelings, emotions, and kind of creating a little story of what you're feeling kind of helps get rid of some of that angst and emotion as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So I write fiction. I write a lot of flash fiction, which is really short stories. But a lot of those I've based on things that have happened to me in my life, and it really helps actually. And I'm writing a longer novel at the moment, and a lot of that is based on it's kind of dark comedy, but a lot of it is based on my experience and the experience of talking to other men as well. Because I think if you can, well, it's twofold. So first of all, it helps you uh, in the same way journaling or writing stories does, because you're articulating something and it's part of a healing process, I think. And secondly, in the same way that these podcasts help, it's telling stories, in these case fictional stories, but they are based on things that a lot of men experience, and therefore it's getting it out there, and whether people read it or not, but if they do, then that's another way of just getting the message out there, the stories out there, that you're not alone. Other people have experienced this, and this hopefully it's kind of a form of entertainment as well along the way.
Yeah, I agree. I think just listening to people's stories, like having a conversation like we're having, it is great to hear other people's perspectives because most people, they don't get to hear people talking honestly about kind of their emotions, and this way it gives people opportunity to kind of talk, let it out, and then know that they're not alone in this, you know.
Yeah, and I have to say, all the men I've spoken to, I'm always really humbled actually at their honesty, and how willing they are to talk really openly about their experiences. And sometimes they're quite emotional about it, because it's, even though it might be the 50th time they've talked about it, it's still very it's still very emotional and difficult to talk about. But I always feel incredibly humbled by it. Every single man I speak to who tells their story, and um, I should say I get approached by a lot of coaches and therapists who want to come on the show, and not to say what they're talking about is not incredibly valuable, but actually the essence of the show, the Midlife Men show, is it's men talking about their first-hand experiences, their own recovery narratives. Because I think my audience, anyway, they want to connect. They want to know that the person that I'm interviewing has walked in their shoes, understands it, has, isn't trying to educate them or lecture them, or, you know, I don't think a lot of men want that. They don't want to listen to something where they're just going to be told what to do by a doctor, however interesting or amazing it is, that they're what they're telling them. So, I think for me anyway, I try and keep true to the nature of what I think my audience wants to hear. And therefore, as I said, the honesty is truly humbling actually, because people find in that scenario that they're sharing, and they know that the stories they're sharing are hopefully going to help other men.
Yeah, I definitely see that as being helpful, right? Because a lot of times if somebody's talking with somebody, people are talking over their head. They're talking kind of through them or over them and not really at them. And I think having conversations like this, we're communicating to each other, and then people are listening to that and actually feel like they're being communicated to instead of at. And I think that's very important. I think that's why this matters to me as much as it does.
And I often think, it doesn't have to be deadly, deadpan and miserable and serious.
Right,
There's humor in this as well. I mean, so many of the guys I speak to, there's humor in their experiences. They laugh about it, even though it's deadly serious.
right.
But life's serious and funny, and I think that helps as well because you know, who wants to listen to a podcast where you've just got it's just really heavy
Right.
going the whole time? And I think it's far more reflective, even though you're talking about serious issues around mental health, it's far more reflective of how people are, because there's humor, there's kind of this concept of blitz humor, kind of in the
Right.
worst case scenario, it's you can still find humor, so I think that really works as well to connect to other men.
Yeah, and I'm learning that as well. And I'm trying to balance that line of being tactful and then not cracking a joke with somebody and then making them be like, really? like, no, that wasn't meant to be offensive. I just thought it would be something to lighten the mood and tension. So, like, I'm still learning it too, and how to effectively communicate as a podcast host and be able to tell the story. And, you know, sometimes I'm just like, it's hard. I don't know if you've had that where you just do I broach this? I have a joke or I have something I can say that would lighten the mood. And have you had one go sour?
Um, do you know I haven't? I mean, I always, we did this. I always make sure I have conversation in advance, or we agree what we're going to talk about. Um, and I judge the mood as well. So it's never we never go in without knowing what we're going to talk about or having a kind of structure and a set of questions. I've never let anything go sour. I mean, hopefully, I'm a good judge of when to. I mean, actually, it's more my guests introducing the humor, and I'll be led by that actually. Um, but there is humor. There's humor in everything really, and just because there's humor in death. I mean, I know, you know, people might think, well, what are you talking about? It's just a terribly sad. It is, but there's always something. There's always some humor there, whatever it is, and I think that helps. It kind of helps lift what can sometimes be a really difficult conversation to have, um, and difficult to listen to as well if you're listening to the podcast. Um, and I think it just helps it become more real, and easier to relate to.
Yeah, I agree. And usually, like when it comes time when I say at a funeral procession, whatever, you kind of tell some of the funny stories of somebody's life, and it kind of helps lighten the mood, like you're saying. But it also it creates a little bit more of a kind of a temporary acceptance, right? And you're kind of going through the motions. You're telling a good story about somebody, and everybody just cracks up laughing. It's a good time, and you got to remember the good times, right? Because struggles are going to happen, but it's the good times that kind of get you through those struggles.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's about, as I said, for me, it's a podcast about recovery narratives. It's about people telling their stories, and yeah, there's some really dark times and harrowing times, but there are also some lighter times and some times which and that humor can still find its way into the story without belittling it or diluting its impact. And hey, aren't we all have two sides to us? So and I think with especially with things like with bereavement and death. I mean, certainly in my opinion, we don't talk about it enough, and so and it's inevitable, right? Everyone's going to die. Everyone you know is going to die. You don't know when. So it's going to happen to you, right? But we don't prepare ourselves, or certainly I don't think majority of people prepare themselves. So when it happens, it's such a horrific shock that everybody's just unable to cope with it. Whereas if and maybe it's the same with mental health. I mean, so many people are going to experience some sort of mental health situation in their life, and it might be very minor, it might not be. But instead of it being a massive surprise to everybody around them and themselves and in society, it should just be, it's part of life, isn't it? Part of the human condition. Uh, Mental illness, physical illness, apparently one in two of us are going to get some sort of cancer, hopefully not all, terminal cancer, but we are, and we are all going to have to deal with that. So, if we embed that more into the conversations we have in society and into our expectations and into expectations of other people, then hopefully that makes it easier, right? For all of us to deal with it when it happens.
Yeah, exactly, man. I grew up on like Benny Hill, Monty Python, and all the quirky kind of situational kind of dark humor, slapstick, and you know that growing up, and I didn't have the greatest life. I didn't have the worst life, right? I just was a kid growing up, broken home, right? Mother cared for me dearly, but had to work a lot to try to make ends meet. So I did a lot of kind of my growing up watching comedy. Like to me, life's a tragedy, right? But to me, I like having that comedy to kind of take me out of that mindset a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed all those British comedians. Um, yeah, and you're right. I mean, certainly, I think the UK has quite a dark and sarcastic, sense of humour. Um, but there's great US comedy as well. I mean, in the UK, we've had loads of kind of comedy from over the pond for many years, and it's kind of embedded into the UK culture as much as the US, I think. Yeah, we all like to laugh, don't we? I mean, that's a medicine in its own right.
Yeah, that a little bit of an endorphin rush from a good laugh, right? So, is
Yeah.
midlife crisis really a crisis, an awakening, or a reckoning?
Well, that's a good question. I think it depends, doesn't it, where how you view it. I mean, I do think it's a natural thing. As I said at the beginning, I think we have phases in life. So I think it's a natural kind of reckoning in a way.
Hmm.
It's how you manage it. I think if you go into it unhappy with your life, unhappy with your job and your relationship and everything else, and it's going to turn into a crisis of some sort. The crisis is just another way of saying that you are struggling. Um, but I think personally that there's nothing wrong with changing your approach to life as you get a bit older. Especially once 50 is not the magic number, but once you're going to hit 50, you can kind of see slightly over the horizon. You have a sense of your mortality,
Right.
um, and I think things are more important, and other things are less important. And I think if you just go through life not adapting to that, then think not everybody, but I think that's when problems can happen. What's wrong with taking a different approach to your work environment? You don't have to. There's no law that says you've got to work from 8 till 6, 5 days a week, and hardly take any holiday and except working at weekends. I mean, there's no law that says you have to do that. And actually, there's only so many people in their 50s, for example, who are going to be at the top of the tree. So it's going to be a lot of disappointed people. It doesn't mean, why don't you do something else? Do something which is more fulfilling. It's not going to happen overnight. Have a plan. So just try and plan for your middle years. And I know that's difficult because you don't really know what you want until you get there. But I do think there's nothing wrong with taking a different approach to life. And hey, if you're in the wrong relationship, well, you need to think about that. What worked when you were younger perhaps isn't going to work when you're older. And certainly, I think health suddenly becomes a lot more important because when you're young, right, you can do whatever you want and it doesn't
Yeah.
seem to matter. But once you get older, it starts to take effect if you're not looking after yourself and what you put in your body and the exercise that you do, and it can only be very small things. And when I talk to a lot of men, and so many of them say just tiny things, even if it's 10 minutes a day, or just kind of reconnect with nature. Go and take your shoes and socks off and stand on grass.
Right.
Just something as simple as that, or go outside, go for a walk, get off your backside. These sorts of things, just tiny changes. So I think we're all capable of that. I mean, anybody can do that. I mean, it's a lot. Perhaps it's more difficult to change your career. That takes some planning. Um, but there are small things you can do that are going to help yourself. And so, yeah, so to answer your question, I'm not sure. It's kind of combination of all of it, isn't there? But I think generally, I think there is, I think we have phases in life, and then going into a kind of middle years or older phase is a different phase. And so you're perfectly entitled to think about changes you might want to make. It's going to make you happier, and don't, try and talk to people about it. Don't carry it all yourself, because you're not alone. You're not. Unfortunately, you're not that unique and special, because there's a lot of people who are feeling the same. So talk to them.
Yeah, I kind of liken it to growing up, you have a runway like an airplane. You have a lot of runway to kind of take off. As you get older, you have a little bit less runway. You still have the capability of taking off, but you just have to make sure you're tactical with it, right? And it's just part of that transition when you're young to mid age, and we're all going to go through it. And you still have runway, you still have purpose, you still have this, that, and the other thing, right? But you just have to make sure you're utilizing your time.
I totally agree.
What would you say to the version of yourself from 5 years ago if you had to look back?
That's a good question. I would probably say to myself, strap in, strap in for the ride. Um, you know, just get on with it. If you're not happy, start making changes. Um, you're only bound by yourself. And I know there are financial constraints and other sorts of constraints, but you're only really bound by yourself. And do what you've always wanted to do. And don't put it off. I always wanted to write, and I never did it because I was too busy, or I thought I'll do it next year. Just do it. Just do stuff, little things to make changes, and then slowly they'll build and build into something else. So I kind of wish, and I was starting to do it actually, maybe maybe 5 years, not quite 5 years ago, but I wish I'd started earlier to kind of make those changes and look to be more fulfilled in life. I think I'd say that to myself. You don't have to do what you've always done. You can change.
I'd have to say that, like you, I do regret that I didn't kind of start this journey sooner, but I think it happened when it happened.
Yeah, I think you're right, actually. Yeah, I mean, now you can't go back and change that,
Right.
and maybe it was for a reason, because you need to come to that realization yourself as well. And unless it's the right time, that's not going to happen. You can't force things to come early. Um, yeah, I think that's their wise words.
Well, Philip, hey, I appreciate your time today. If people wanted to get in touch with you, how would they do that?
So if they go to the Midlife Men podcast, it's on Apple, Spotify, all the other channels. There's a website called mid-lifemen.com. Um, on there is a form to fill in to contact me. And there's an email as well, which is midlifemen01@gmail. So they can contact me via that, and I will get back to everybody. Um, but thank you, thanks, Brad. It's been a great conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. Thank you for everything you're doing, and I hope between the both of us we can at least help. If it's just one person, that matters to
Absolutely,
me.
absolutely. That's my goal too. Yeah, yeah. Keep doing your stuff as well, Brad.
All right.
Thanks.
Thanks, Philip. Some of the most important conversations happen long before a solution appears. Midlife often carries a strange mix of pressure and possibility. It can expose the cracks in identities built around work, status, or expectations, while also creating space to reconsider what fulfillment actually means. What stood out in this conversation is the value of simply talking about those moments, naming the uncertainty, sharing the experience, and realizing that many people are navigating similar questions, even if they rarely say it out loud. If this episode resonated, it may be because reflection is often the first step toward change. Not dramatic change, just the quiet decision to start asking better questions about the life you are building. Just a reminder, the stories and conversations in this podcast are for informational and personal reflection only. Nothing shared here should be taken as medical, legal, or professional advice. Always speak with a qualified professional about your own personal situation. Thank you for listening to No One Is Normal. If today's message resonated with you, you can find the book No One Is Normal on Amazon and Kindle, and explore more resources at www.bradhhill.com or www.nooneisnormal.co. Remember, you weren't meant to be normal, you were meant to be you.